With the surrender of Germany and the end of the Second World War, the focus shifted from solely its captured leaders. The true dilemma arose with the technicians and scientists who had fueled the war machine. Criminals due to their participation in the regime, yet also repositories of strategic knowledge, they were viewed with suspicion and, at the same time, with greed. Amid ruins and hidden archives, the Allies uncovered projects that placed Germany at the forefront of science. Among them, the V2, the first long-range ballistic missile, and arsenals of nerve gas capable of annihilating entire armies. What began as a mission to document quickly transformed into a struggle among the victors. The United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom realized that the most valuable prize was not territories or captured leaders, but the minds capable of designing the weapons of the future. From this competition emerged a secret operation that would change the course of the Cold War, Operation Paperclip. This documentary reveals how many of those scientists, despite being war criminals, ended up becoming architects of the military and space power of the United States. The discovery of the V2, the technology that foreshadowed the Cold War. In the spring of 1945, as Germany crumbled, Allied armies advanced through devastated cities, concentration camps, and forced labor factories. With each step, not only the regime's crimes were uncovered, but also hidden scientific facilities that revealed another dimension of the war, the battle for knowledge. Specialized teams from the Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee hurried to document every finding, aware that what they found would serve not only as evidence of atrocities, but also as potential tools for the future. On the 11th of April, soldiers from the 104th Infantry Division entered the tunnels of Nordhausen. Among them was John Risen Jones Jr., with a Leica camera in hand. What was expected to be just another day of combat turned into an unforgettable experience, bodies piled on the ground, prisoners reduced to shadows of themselves, and a silence broken only by muffled laments. Shortly after, Dutch officer William J. Ullmans arrived, describing the extreme malnutrition and tuberculosis that claimed lives every hour. There, amid the devastation, a seemingly minor discovery would prove immensely significant: a telephone directory with the names of Reich technicians and engineers. That document directly posed a question already lingering in the air: what to do with them? The same question arose with each new discovery. In Gereberg, hidden among forests, a complex with laboratories and animal testing stables was found, linked to Kurt Blom, a doctor in charge of biological warfare programs. Further north, in Völkenrode, disguised as simple farms, lay the world's most advanced aeronautical research center. Engineer Adolf Bussmann acknowledged that the institute had been operational for a decade. Specialists from Operation Lusty intervened immediately, ordering all its materials to be transferred to the United States, aware that every minute counted in the race against the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the Nazi leadership sank into intrigue and desperation. Hitler remained holed up in his bunker, Speer managed to bid farewell to an exhausted dictator, and Himmler explored escape plans through neutral countries. However, for the Allies, the priority was no longer the leaders but the men of science. The liberation of Dachau confirmed this. Alongside thousands of prisoners and corpses, a Luftwaffe laboratory was found containing vials with human tissues and preserved insects. Young Dr. Marcus J. Smith recorded the survivors' suffering, unaware that some of those responsible for these experiments would end up working on American research programs. The collapse of the Reich accelerated key captures. Several doctors and technicians fell into Soviet or British hands, while those responsible for the V2 sought their own path. That missile, considered the first long-range ballistic projectile in history and designed to strike Allied cities, had been developed by Wernher von Braun under the direction of Walter Dornberger. Both chose to surrender to the Americans, convinced that their knowledge was a bargaining chip. It was Magnus von Braun, the engineer's brother, who approached an Allied post to negotiate. That same night, the group was transferred to Reuter, where they were photographed and treated with deference. Werner presented himself as the creator of the V2, omitting any responsibility for the use of slave labor. The net also reached the chemical industry. Hermann Schmitz, director of IG Farben, was arrested in a modest residence with documents linking him to the regime's highest echelons. Georg Ricke, former director of Nordhausen, was found in a salt mine and, in an attempt to secure his future, handed over boxes of V2 blueprints to the Americans. Even Himmler tried to escape under a false identity, but was recognized in a British camp. He carried poison capsules and, during a medical examination, bit one to end his life. The most feared face of the regime vanished, but the scientific apparatus remained intact, now under the control of the victors. The war was coming to an end. Nazi leaders dissolved amid arrests, trials, and deaths, but the scientists remained a prize of incalculable value. The great question was what to do with them: judge them as criminals, or enlist them in the service of their former enemies in the name of progress. From that tension, a clandestine operation was born in silence, one that would shape the world after 1945, Operation Paperclip. Nordhausen and Bleicherode, the discovery that changed US strategy. On paper, the Allied mission seemed clear: disarm, demilitarize and denazify Germany, but in practice, the boundaries were blurred. Lieutenant Colonel John O'Mara of the CYOS warned that the mistake of 1918 could not be repeated, when the ban on German aviation failed to prevent the Luftwaffe from becoming Europe's most powerful air force within 2 decades. This time, ignoring scientific potential was unthinkable. According to initial orders, all research was to cease, and specialists were interned in custody centers across Europe. Over 1,500 were held under surveillance, separated from regular prisoners of war. In Bavaria were Wernher von Braun and Walter Dornberger. Other groups were scattered across Austria, France, and naval bases. They included rocket experts, doctors, engineers, and chemists. Eisenhower, aware of what was at stake, requested instructions from Washington: detain them, release them, or use them. The response was slow to arrive and lacked a clear plan. In this vacuum, parallel initiatives emerged. At the Pentagon, General Kenneth Wolfe insisted on wasting no time. He argued that transferring scientists and equipment to the United States would not only prevent a German resurgence, but also boost American industry. Though Lucius Clay, then Deputy Military Governor of occupied Germany, considered it premature, Wolfe traveled to Nordhausen. There, faced with the remnants of the V2 program in the Mittelwerk tunnels, he became convinced that exploiting Nazi science must begin immediately. This view was soon adopted by young officer Robert Staver, leading the Special Mission V2, an Allied unit created specifically to locate and transfer German rocket technology. Having survived 2 V2 strikes in London, he knew their destructive power firsthand. Upon arriving in Nordhausen, he coordinated the collection of tons of parts and documents to be sent to the United States. However, he was aware that without blueprints or engineers, all that material was little more than scrap. For days he roamed villages in the Harz Mountains, trading cigarettes for leads on the project's specialists. Time was against him. In a few weeks, control of the area would pass to the Soviets, irreversibly increasing the risk of losing the scientific prize. Not everyone in the Allied circle shared this urgency. Physicist H.P. Robertson, an advisor to Eisenhower, acknowledged the value of the rockets, but opposed granting privileges to those who had served the Nazi regime. Trained at Princeton alongside Einstein, he believed German scientists had a moral obligation to resist Hitler. To him, working with them now legitimized their past. Yet, the Soviet threat forced him to relent. He authorized artillery officer James Staver, responsible for evaluating the captured rocket program, to proceed and provided a crucial lead. Many of the V2 documents might be hidden in a salt mine in Bleicherode in central Germany. While Staver pursued this lead, Robertson traveled south to Garmisch-Partenkirchen, where Wernher von Braun, his superior Walter Dornberger and other engineers were interned in relatively comfortable quarters. In contrast to the country's devastation, they lived surrounded by green mountains and good food. Initially, they spoke candidly, hoping it would hasten their transfer to the United States. But when no guarantees materialized, they grew silent. Colonel Walter Jessel noted how Dornberger ordered information withheld. Revealing too much could lead to accusations over the use of slave labor. Arthur Rudolph, responsible for the Mittelwerk underground plant, knew this well. His interrogators described him as a committed Nazi, but he trusted his expertise would outweigh his past. He even began studying English. Meanwhile, Stava located the blueprints in Bleicherode. The discovery was monumental, but the timeline turned it into a race against the clock. Everything had to be evacuated before the 1st of June, when the area would pass to Soviet control. From there he headed to Paris, where he urged Colonel Joel Holmes to act without delay. Documents alone were not enough. The engineers had to be transferred too. If the United States wanted to master rocket technology, it needed to incorporate them immediately. The cable he sent from Paris was brief but forceful. It reported that over 400 Peenemünde specialists were in custody and warned that their knowledge placed Germany decades ahead of the United States. It also included a troubling detail: an improved V-2 could cross the Atlantic. The message was clear: urgent action was needed to prevent this human capital from falling into Soviet hands. The discovered documents were sent first to Paris and then to Aberdeen, Maryland for analysis. The operation was declared a success, but for Stava, it was just the beginning. He returned to Nordhausen and, with von Braun's help, organized the engineers' evacuation. US troops scoured villages with lists of names, offering transport to entire families before the Soviet arrival. The scenes at the stations were chaotic. Over 1,000 people waited to be boarded, and many refugees tried to blend into the convoys. Soldiers had to restrain the crowds and ensure only authorized individuals boarded. Meanwhile, Stava and his collaborator Porter recovered another cache in Bad Saxe, where Dornberger had buried boxes of sensitive information. Those too ended up in the American zone. When the Red Army entered Nordhausen, it found the underground complex intact. The engineers who rejected the American offer were recruited by Moscow. The scientific legacy of the Reich was thus divided between two powers destined to become rivals. In Washington, however, policy remained ambiguous. There was no clear legal framework. Cases like that of engineer Herbert Wagner, secretly transferred to the United States, demonstrated that technical urgency trumped any moral qualms. The discovery of the submarine U-234, loaded with nuclear materials intended for Japan, further reinforced the idea that each captured scientist could tip the global balance. What had begun as improvised operations in Nordhausen was transforming into a broader plan. Still without an official name, the future Operation Paperclip was already underway. Harry Armstrong and Leopold Alexander, two opposing views on Nazi science. While rocket engineers were being transferred to Allied territory, another branch of Nazi science drew immediate attention: medicine. Luftwaffe doctors had conducted experiments on the human body under extreme cold, altitude, or decompression, and now their previously hidden results could become a resource for American aviation. In this context, two figures with opposing views emerged. On one hand, Harry Armstrong, an American military doctor convinced that German expertise should be utilized. On the other, Leopold Alexander, a Jewish psychiatrist who had fled Nazism and now, as an Allied investigator, was tasked with documenting medical crimes. Between them, a tension arose that would define the future of Hubertus Strughold, director of the Reich's aeronautical medicine. Armstrong had known Strughold from international conferences in the 1930s and, after the war, arrived in Berlin determined to locate Luftwaffe doctors. He soon learned that Strughold had moved to Göttingen and hoped to recruit him as a collaborator. Armstrong saw him as a valuable scientist, not a suspect. For Alexander, however, the situation was different. Strughold's name already appeared on the list of war criminals, and his mission was to interrogate those same doctors for their involvement in Dachau's experiments. Alexander's journey took him first to Munich, where he interrogated Georg August Welz, a Luftwaffe doctor who claimed to have worked on experiments to rescue pilots exposed to hypothermia. Welz presented his studies as humanitarian research conducted on animals. However, his evasiveness and the makeshift facilities he showed raised doubts. In a rural stable, Alexander found wooden vats that, according to Welz, had been used for large animals. A single glance was enough for Alexander to realize they could only have held human bodies. In his diary, he wrote that he was facing a setup to conceal the truth. Prisoners used as guinea pigs. Soon after, testimonies confirmed his suspicions. In Dachau, 3 survivors recounted what had happened. Polish priest Leo Michalowski described how he had been submerged in icy water and forced to ingest alcohol in an attempt at resuscitation. Deadly experiments were disguised in reports with deceptive language. The supposed adult pigs were, in fact, human beings. Around the same time, Armstrong saw Strughold as a man capable of advancing American aeronautical medicine, while Alexander uncovered increasing evidence pointing to Strughold's circle. Documents found in Himmler's archives linked Strughold's close collaborators to Dachau. Although Strughold himself did not appear as a direct perpetrator, the reports suggested he had covered up what happened. Other doctors reinforced the suspicion. One confessed in tears that he had refused to participate because he considered himself too soft, thus admitting that the projects were discussed in official circles and were not mere isolated initiatives. The decisive moment came when Alexander accessed letters from Zygmunt Rascher to Himmler. They detailed pressure and freezing experiments conducted in Dachau, with plans to transfer them to Auschwitz and expand them. A film was even mentioned, screened at the Air Ministry, where senior officials had witnessed the trials. Among the organizers was a close collaborator of Strughold. With this, the tension grew. For Alexander, Luftwaffe doctors had crossed the line between science and crime. For Armstrong, they remained key pieces in the future of aviation. When Strughold was finally interrogated in Göttingen, the reports were contradictory. Alexander described him as a cover-up artist, while the American and British Air Forces presented him as a scientist of great value. His fate remained caught in this unresolved tension, foreshadowing how Nazi doctors would transition from suspects to collaborators in secret programs. On another investigative front, Allied attention turned to chemistry. The fall of the Reich revealed previously unknown arsenals. In the forests of Münster Nord, thousands of bombs loaded with tabun, a nerve agent unknown in the West, were discovered. Shortly afterward, samples of this compound were secretly sent to American laboratories, and analyses confirmed the worst fears. They were capable of neutralizing entire armies in minutes. The contradiction was clear. Roosevelt had called the use of gases immoral and inhumane, but in 1945, with demobilization underway, the US Chemical Warfare Service saw these substances as the perfect opportunity to justify its continued existence. Hundreds of tons crossed the Atlantic under strict secrecy. The next step was to identify those responsible. In requisitioned castles and laboratories, the Allies gathered dozens of chemists from IG Farben, the German industrial giant. Among them, Gerhard Schrader explained how his search for an agricultural pesticide had led to an unexpected discovery. A compound 100 times more lethal than any known insecticide, later developed into tabun and subsequently sarin. However, the key figure was not Schrader, but Otto Ambros. A trained chemist and executive at IG Farben, he had risen from researcher to one of the consortium's most influential managers. Beneath a cordial, almost provincial demeanor, it was he who selected Auschwitz to establish the Buna complex, justifying the choice based on its resources and, above all, the abundance of slave labor. Internal records revealed his negotiations with Himmler to ensure a steady supply of prisoners. At the same time, he coordinated the production of nerve agents in Gendorf and Dyhern-Fürth. His expertise was critical, from the synthesis of gases to the design of silver-lined vats to prevent corrosion. The Allies knew this well. For this reason, Ambros was not treated as an ordinary prisoner, but as a collaborator in special interrogations. His answers unlocked access to equipment and blueprints that would otherwise have remained hidden. Thus, in a matter of days, a suspect of crimes against humanity could transform into a strategic asset. Ambros's case illustrates this clearly. While organizations like Fiat or CIOS labeled him a criminal, he was settled in villas near Heidelberg, surrounded by courtesies, and even demanded the release of other chemists in exchange for his cooperation. As pressure mounted, he sought support in the French zone, offering information in return for protection. To some, he was an unforgivable criminal. To others, a resource too valuable to lose. Later reports indicated that officers from the Chemical Warfare Service facilitated his release and connected him with representatives of private industry. In 1945, in meetings held in Heidelberg, Ambros was already discussing with intermediaries from Dow Chemical the applications of the knowledge accumulated at Farben. The line between science, business and crime was becoming increasingly blurred. Meanwhile, Allied attention also shifted toward biology. In the same center where chemists were interrogated, the name of Kurt Blome, Deputy Health Director of the Reich, surfaced. At first, he denied any responsibility, but soon offered a different version. According to him, it was Himmler who pressured him to research bubonic plague, obsessed with using it as a weapon while simultaneously developing an experimental vaccine tested on prisoners. Documents and testimonies pointed to facilities in Nesselstedt and Geraberg, where Blome coordinated laboratories equipped for animal testing and investigators suspected also human testing. Himmler pushed for larger-scale projects, viruses capable of attacking crops, livestock, or civilian populations. Diseases like tularemia, foot and mouth disease, and influenza were discussed, though Blome warned that an uncontrolled outbreak could endanger German soldiers themselves. The program even tested variants of bovine plague on the island of Reims, where fields with healthy cattle were sprayed. At the war's end, the Red Army captured these facilities intact, along with the strains, meaning the Soviet Union now controlled an invisible arsenal, perhaps more fearsome than Farben's chemical weapons. Albert Einstein publicly denounces Operation Paperclip. Across the Atlantic, American authorities were no longer focused solely on documenting crimes, but on securing control of that knowledge. The transition was marked by a renewed push for the Paperclip program. The fall of the main Nazi leaders at Nuremberg coincided with a decisive shift in the program. While the ashes of the condemned were scattered into a river, a directive was signed in Washington that altered the visa procedure for German scientists. The State Department's oversight was sidelined, and the Immigration Commission, based on military reports, would now approve entries to the country. In practice, this meant compromising information could be omitted, opening the door to the arrival of direct collaborators of the regime. Paperclip ceased to be a temporary plan and became a program of exclusion, denying the Soviet bloc access to those minds, even if it meant ignoring their ties to the Nazi past. Within months, more than 200 scientists were under custody in the United States. The news, leaked by East Berlin newspapers, was picked up by the American press, sparking a debate that quickly escalated. To calm public opinion, the War Department decided to offer a controlled version of the facts. It organized open days at Wright Field, the large airbase in Ohio dedicated to military aviation testing, where airship engineers and turbine experts were presented as mere technicians with no reference to their wartime work. Carefully selected photographs showed them playing chess, strolling through shops, or enjoying the sun in Ohio. The official narrative insisted that none had been Nazis, that they were all men of science and family, essential to national security. However, complaints were mounting in parallel. Internal files identified several of them as members of the SA or SS, and even participants in the persecution of Jews. Organizations like the American Jewish Congress or the Society for the Prevention of World War III accused the government of rewarding those who had served the regime, while thousands of displaced people languished in camps with no future. Eleanor Roosevelt joined the criticism and convened a conference in New York, with Albert Einstein as the guest of honor, to demand a moratorium on granting visas to Germans. Social pressure clashed with the growing military dependence on these specialists. At Wright Field, where most were concentrated, groups and rivalries began to form among them, and internal tensions soon brought the past of some to light. This was how the name of Georg Ricke, former head of Mittelwerk, once again became the center of controversy. Georg Ricke's name, until then just another engineer on the Paperclip roster, started to become a problem for the US Army. His expertise in underground construction had made him valuable, as he had not only overseen rocket assembly at Mittelwerk, but also the construction of fortified bunkers like Hitler's in Berlin. The sturdiness of that structure, designed to withstand continuous bombings, piqued the interest of commanders already contemplating the possibility of a conflict involving nuclear weapons. Ricky was consulted to design facilities capable of maintaining operational command in the event of a massive attack, an idea that years later would give rise to secret complexes like Raven Rock or Mount Weather. But while his technical contributions were being evaluated in Washington, his behavior at Wright Field raised suspicions. Together with Albert Patton, he organized a lucrative black market operation dealing in alcohol and tobacco with the help of his sister settled in Ohio. The business thrived without interference from authorities, despite his mail being monitored. The situation led to tensions with other Germans, and a trivial altercation with engineer Hermann Nielsen ended up revealing far more than expected. Nielsen not only accused him of indiscipline, but claimed that Ricky had participated in public executions at Nordhausen, where prisoners were hanged from cranes in front of slave laborers to instill fear. The accusations reached Washington, and an intelligence officer, Major Eugene Smith, was tasked with investigating. His work led him to interview Ricky's former colleagues, first in New York and then in Fort Bliss, where many rocket engineers resided. The pattern he uncovered was troubling: vague memories, evasions, and contradictions among witnesses. However, key figures like Arthur Rudolph eventually confirmed, albeit indirectly, that the executions had taken place and that they had witnessed them firsthand. While the case progressed in offices, Ricky signed a 5-year contract with the War Department. His integration into Paperclip seemed secure until a chance discovery in Germany changed everything. Dutch investigator William Almans, a tracker of Nazi criminals, recognized Ricky's name in a small notice in stars and stripes. Ricky had applied for US citizenship. The news, received almost by chance, triggered a chain of communications that reached the Joint Chiefs of Staff within days. The fate of the engineer, until then protected by his technical usefulness, was about to become irreversibly complicated. On the 19th of May 1947, an arrest warrant was issued for Georg Ricke, accused as the main person responsible in the Nordhausen case. The engineer tried to deny his involvement, claiming it was a case of mistaken identity. However, former colleagues like Dr. Karl Rahr confirmed he was the same man who had overseen operations at Mittelwerk. The decision was clear. His contract at Wright Field was terminated, and Ricky was sent back to Germany to be tried in Dachau alongside 18 other defendants. The trial for the Dora Nordhausen crimes brought to light the deaths of thousands of prisoners forced to manufacture rockets under inhumane conditions. The prosecution requested the presence of Wernher von Braun as a witness, but the army refused to transfer him, citing the risk of kidnapping by the Soviets. The real reason was different. Von Braun had just returned from Germany after marrying his cousin and bringing her to the United States. After months of hearings, 15 defendants were convicted, while Ricky was acquitted. The outcome, unexpected for many, was buried under a veil of secrecy. The army classified the entire file, aware that public exposure would jeopardize the legitimacy of Paperclip and its nascent missile program. Simultaneously, new specialists continued to arrive at Wright Field. Among them stood out Siegfried Knemeyer, one of Goering's closest pilots, whose expertise in air navigation was quickly utilized by the US Air Force. Despite his family's struggles to adapt in Ohio, his talent established him as a key figure in developing flight instruments. Shortly after, Walter Dornberger, former head of the Reich's rocket program, also joined. The British had described him as a dangerous and manipulative man, but in 1947 he signed a contract with the US Army, producing strategic reports advocating for accelerated missile research without regard for democratic principles or economic constraints. The arrival of these figures coincided with growing criticism in academic circles. Organizations like the Federation of American Scientists, with prominent voices like Hans Bethe and Albert Einstein himself, publicly denounced the United States for opening its doors to committed Nazis, contradicting the values for which the war had been fought. The Nazi scientist who secretly advised NASA and the Pentagon. The initial controversies surrounding Paperclip were soon overshadowed by a new scenario. With the Cold War underway, many of those scientists found the opportunity to reinvent themselves and present themselves as pioneers of a different era. Some remained hidden in classified chemical and biological weapons programs, their files sealed for decades. Others, however, seized the growing fascination with space to position themselves as trailblazers of a new age. Among them, Walter Dornberger went from being a prisoner considered dangerous to a respected figure in the aerospace sector. In 1950, he left military custody to join Bell Aircraft in New York, where he rose to vice president and Pentagon advisor on missiles and space weaponry. He frequently participated in public conferences, delivering eloquent speeches on the conquest of space while avoiding any mention of the forced labor system in Nordhausen. His autobiography, published in Germany in 1952 and in the United States 2 years later, contributed to this image rehabilitation. The V2 was portrayed as a scientific milestone, not the result of the exploitation of thousands of prisoners. His interest in the militarization of space led him to promote projects like WWII, a rocket plane designed for nuclear combat missions. While it generated enthusiasm in certain circles, it also raised suspicions. An FBI report even described him as a man capable of acting as a double agent, highlighting his cunning and adaptability. However, the true public face of Paperclip was Wernher von Braun. After tests at White Sands, the Army transferred his team to Huntsville, Alabama, to work on longer-range missiles. There, von Braun began cultivating an image as a space visionary. In 1952, he gained notoriety with a series of articles in Collier's, where he discussed the imminent arrival of satellites and orbital stations, warning that they could be tools of peace or platforms for carrying atomic bombs. The message resonated with the collective imagination of a nation looking to the skies amid competition with Moscow. He soon expanded his presence to other media. In an article published under his name in national magazines, he proclaimed his faith in democracy and rejection of Nazism, crafting a narrative of a politically neutral scientist trapped by circumstances. This image solidified when Walt Disney invited him to participate in the Man in Space series. Aired in 1955, the program was watched by over 40 million people and turned von Braun into a celebrity. That same year, he and several of his colleagues received U.S. citizenship in a public ceremony in Huntsville. In 1958, his team launched Explorer 1, the first American satellite, presented as a direct response to the Soviet Sputnik challenge. In 1960, the story of Paperclip entered a new phase. Wernher von Braun and approximately 120 engineers and technicians were transferred to the newly created agency embodying America's space ambitions, NASA. There, at the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, von Braun took the helm and became the primary architect of the Saturn V, the colossal rocket intended to take humans to the moon. Among his collaborators was Arthur Rudolph, an engineer with experience in V2 production during the war, now a key figure in the project's organization. To accommodate a vehicle of such magnitude, the program chose Cape Canaveral, Florida, as its base. Within this complex, the vertical assembly building was constructed on Merritt Island, a monumental structure overseen by Bernhard Tessmann, who years earlier had worked at the Peenemünde Research Center. Von Braun's rise coincided with a deliberate effort to keep his past in the shadows. He never spoke of his Nazi Party membership or his SS rank, details that would have been sufficient to invalidate his residency under the Internal Security Act of 1950. Both he and his superiors in Washington knew that revealing these facts would have jeopardized the legitimacy of the entire space program. In practice, a public narrative was constructed in which von Braun appeared as a scientist coerced by circumstances, a man devoted to science who would have worked with equal fervor in any country. Nevertheless, the shadows never fully disappeared. They sometimes surfaced in the form of cruel jokes, such as a comment about the texture of a leather jacket reminiscent of medical experiments in the camps. Other times they emerged in propaganda campaigns, like a book published in East Berlin in 1963, which depicted him in an SS uniform and detailed the conditions in Nordhausen. NASA's response was firm. It was agreed that if questions arose, von Braun should insist that the US government was fully aware of his record. The Cold War also played its part. From Moscow and East Berlin, stories blending truths and exaggerations were spread to discredit America's space hero. In the West, these accusations were dismissed as propaganda, though they contained elements of truth. To avoid risks, when a new trial about the crimes in Dora opened in Germany, NASA refused to let von Braun travel to testify and arranged for his statement to be taken discreetly at a US consulate. The procedure was sealed and kept out of the public's reach. The official silence allowed his image to solidify as the architect of the lunar triumph. When Apollo 11 took flight in 1969, von Braun's name became definitively associated with the most celebrated technological feat of the century. Questions about the past were sidelined, overshadowed by the glory of the American flag unfurled on the moon's surface. In the late 1940s, while Wernher von Braun was consolidating his public image, another scientist brought over through Paperclip was making strides in a less visible but equally critical field: space medicine. Hubertus Strughold had arrived in 1947 at the School of Aviation Medicine at Randolph Air Force Base in Texas. Under his direction, a group of German doctors and technicians began working alongside Major Harry Armstrong to shape a new field, still viewed by many as science fiction: the adaptation of the human body to space. In 1948, Strughold participated in the first attempt to send a living organism into space aboard a V-2 rocket. The small macaque Albert was launched from White Sands in a capsule designed by his team. The animal died during the flight, but the experiment proved it was possible to study physiological reactions in near-space conditions. That same year, Armstrong and Strughold organized the first official symposium on space biology in the United States, a decisive step toward institutionalizing this discipline within the armed forces. The creation of the Department of Space Medicine at Randolph in 1949 marked the starting point of an ambitious, long-term program. When Armstrong was reassigned to the Pentagon shortly thereafter, Strughold took charge of the research, establishing himself as a central figure. From there, he not only managed medical projects, but also facilitated the arrival of more German colleagues. He even attempted to recruit doctors who had been prosecuted at Nuremberg, such as Siegfried Ruf or Konrad Schäfer. The latter, implicated in seawater experiments at Dachau, ended up working in Texas, though his superiors deemed him incompetent, and he eventually left the institution to join the private sector in New York. During the early 1950s, the school gained international prominence. Articles were published on the effects of weightlessness, cosmic radiation, and fluid elimination in space, many authored by Paperclip scientists. At the same time, some studies remained classified under military secrecy, particularly those related to nuclear warfare. Strughold himself suggested investigating instantaneous blindness caused by atomic flashes, leading to tests with animals and soldiers exposed to detonations in Nevada. In parallel, Strughold continued refining spaceflight simulations. In 1954, a pressurized chamber capable of replicating conditions for a trip to the moon was constructed, designed by Fritz Haber. Increasingly longer tests were conducted with volunteers, including one lasting 7 consecutive days in 1958, designed to measure endurance and performance in confinement. For Strughold, these experiments confirmed that medicine was an essential pillar in the future exploration of the cosmos. The 1958 confinement experiment with Donald Farrell elevated Hubertus Strughold to recognition beyond military circles. The presence of Senator Lyndon B. Johnson, who accompanied him before the press, was a symbol of public legitimization. Shortly afterward, Johnson invited him to Washington, along with dozens of congressmen and high-ranking Air Force officials, where Strughold presented, in 5 minutes, his vision of space medicine as a necessary discipline to prepare humanity for flights beyond the atmosphere. With that gesture, the German doctor entered the circle of scientists endorsed by American political power. However, that ascent was interrupted by an unexpected reminder of his past. In 1958, Time magazine hailed him as a pioneer of space biomedicine, but weeks later, the Saturday Review published an editorial by Julian Bach Jr., a veteran war correspondent, which recalled the medical experiments conducted in concentration camps. Bach pointed to Strughold as being aware of the freezing experiments carried out at Dachau, thus questioning the clean image he had cultivated in Texas. The impact was immediate. The Immigration Office opened an investigation, though it was quickly closed after assurances from the military that Strughold had been appropriately vetted before obtaining citizenship. In reality, his classified intelligence file, which noted his affinity with the Nazi regime, was never consulted. That same year, Strughold shared the spotlight with Harry Armstrong and Walter Dornberger at a medical symposium held in San Antonio, surrounded by several former colleagues transferred from Germany. Now a US citizen, he began crafting his own narrative. He published numerous articles, introduced terms like bioastronautics or astrobiology, and wrote popular science books. In interviews, he claimed to have been an opponent of Nazism, even persecuted by Hitler, a reinvention that ignored his rank as a medical colonel in the Luftwaffe and his proximity to colleagues who had participated in documented crimes. Over time, his scientific achievements and carefully constructed narrative overshadowed the doubts. Although in 1973, Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal called for an investigation into his possible involvement in experiments at Ravensbrück, no conclusive evidence was found. The issue resurfaced in the press, but was again dismissed by US authorities. Years later, in 1977, the Air Force honored him by dedicating its Aerospace Medical Library in San Antonio to him, with a plaque proclaiming him the father of space medicine. The recognition seemed to seal a career that, despite its shadows, had become intertwined with the history of space conquest. In contrast to the recognition they received in the United States, the 1960s in West Germany reopened old wounds. The start of the Auschwitz trial in Frankfurt in 1963 marked a turning point. For the first time since the end of the war, German judges heard testimonies from hundreds of survivors who detailed the operations of the extermination camp. The trial publicly exposed former guards and doctors who until then had lived under their own names as respectable citizens. The contrast between their past and their everyday lives as merchants, pharmacists, or civil servants was a stark wake-up call for a society that had preferred to look the other way. Among the accused indirectly implicated was a name fully tied to the legacy of Paperclip, Otto Ambros. Although he had already been convicted at Nuremberg for his responsibility in the use of slave labor at the Buna plant in Auschwitz and released after less than 3 years in prison, his figure resurfaced during the Frankfurt trial. Called to testify in 1963, Ambros offered an account that downplayed the conditions of the industrial complex, even describing it as a cozy place. The claim was insulting to the witnesses present, and international journalists quickly confronted the contradictions with what he had admitted in 1947. Investigative journalism revealed something even more disturbing. Ambros had not only resumed a normal life, but held positions on the boards of major private companies and state-controlled enterprises. The fees he received came, in part, from public funds, sparking outrage in international opinion, especially among Israeli correspondents. Media pressure exposed the complacent attitude with which German political and economic sectors had protected a man convicted of slavery and murder. The unrest reached official circles. Finance Minister Ludger Westrick, far from distancing himself from the controversy, intervened on Ambros's behalf, circulating documents prepared by his lawyer among various boards that portrayed him as a victim of the Nazi regime rather than one of its collaborators. In his private correspondence, Ambros acknowledged Westrick's help in recovering his social standing and expressed confidence in maintaining ties with foreign companies, including some based in Israel. Public exposure eventually forced his exit from several companies, though he was never fully removed from Germany's industrial and financial network. The Ambros case, emerging in the midst of the Cold War, revealed the extent to which strategic and economic interests could outweigh historical accountability, highlighting an uncomfortable paradox. While scientists were glorified in America, in Europe, the memory of their crimes began to crack the facades of respectability they had built after the war. The echo of the Frankfurt trial not only stirred the past in Germany, but also brought renewed international scrutiny to figures linked to Nazi science. Otto Ambros, whose comfortable life after his release had been exposed, found himself decades later at the center of an even greater scandal. In the 1980s, it came to light that he had worked as a consultant for the American company W.R. Grace, and, more seriously, had collaborated with the Department of Energy on coal hydrogenation projects. The news that a man convicted of slavery and mass murder had been hired by the US government sparked outrage in Congress and the press. The Department of Energy merely stated that the documentation on those contracts had been lost, an argument that was hard to accept. The matter reached the White House. President Ronald Reagan himself received a report from his Deputy National Security Advisor, James W. Nance, explaining that Ambros was not an isolated case, as he had also been sought by corporations and agencies in various European countries. The official defense focused on presenting his technical expertise as justification for these collaborations. Even the president could not obtain full information on the true extent of Ambros's contacts with the US administration, highlighting how deeply buried the traces of Operation Paperclip remained. While Ambros maintained his role as a privileged consultant, another Third Reich doctor, Kurt Blohm, followed a different path. In 1962, doctors from Karl Marx University in Leipzig published an open letter denouncing his past as the head of biological research and his involvement in human experiments. The text directly called him out before the German public, and Blohm responded in a radio interview, insisting on his innocence and blaming Walter Schreiber for fabricating accusations against him. The Dortmund Public Prosecutor's Office then opened an investigation that uncovered a 1942 document in which Blohm proposed a special solution for tens of thousands of Poles sick with tuberculosis, a term that in Nazi language meant extermination. Despite the document's weight, Blohm relied on the same argument used at Nuremberg, the lack of evidence that the order was carried out. With that justification, the case was closed, and Blohm continued practicing medicine until his death in 1969, untouched by legal consequences. These episodes reflected the contradictions of the post-war era. While some scientists turned their past into a springboard to prestigious positions in the United States, others re-emerged in the public eye only to underscore how partial and selective justice had been. Harvard archives exposed doctors linked to murders disguised as science. The expulsion of Arthur Rudolph and the controversy surrounding Hubertus Strughold marked a turning point in how American society began to reassess its recent past. For decades, the official narrative had portrayed Operation Paperclip scientists as technical figures, detached from political or criminal responsibilities. However, investigations by the Department of Justice, combined with the persistence of journalists and survivors, revealed hidden stories that seriously undermined the program's legitimacy. The cultural climate of the 1970s and 1980s also fostered this awakening. Congressional hearings on war criminals discovered on American soil exposed the negligence of institutions responsible for screening immigrants. From this effort, the Office of Special Investigations was born, dedicating its resources to identifying and, where possible, prosecuting those who had evaded justice. Concurrently, the 1978 television broadcast of Holocaust reached millions of households, sparking an unprecedented public awareness. Many citizens who had never reflected on the genocide began to question what it truly meant to have harbored former Nazis in the name of national security. In this context, the figure of Eli Rosenbaum emerged, a young lawyer who would soon become one of the leading investigators of war criminals in the United States. By chance, while browsing books in a Cambridge bookstore, he came across two works that profoundly impacted him: the testimony of a Dora camp survivor and a celebratory history of the space conquest that casually mentioned Arthur Rudolph. The juxtaposition of these readings led him to question the way the trajectories of many Reich engineers had been whitewashed. His reaction was not merely intellectual. From then on, he would dedicate his career to uncovering these contradictions. The Rudolph case was the first to reveal on a large scale that the American space dream had roots in tunnels where thousands of prisoners died working as slaves. But it would not be the last. From that moment, every name associated with the Paperclip program came under more intense scrutiny, fueled by documents released through the Freedom of Information Act and the determination of civil organizations. What had remained hidden until then began, little by little, to come to light, forcing a rewriting of an uncomfortable part of Cold War history. The removal of Strughold's name from the walls of the library at Brooks Air Force Base symbolized that even honors considered untouchable could be reconsidered in light of new evidence. This gesture coincided with a broader context, the 1998 congressional approval of the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act, which compelled federal agencies to open previously hidden archives. Under this mandate, an interagency group worked for years reviewing millions of pages, revealing the depth of the relationship between former Nazis and American security structures. The conclusion was clear. It was not a matter of a few exceptions, but a sustained strategy that had sheltered figures directly linked to war crimes. While the United States published reports questioning decades of official justification, new revelations emerged in Europe. In 2008, the Thalidomide Trust in England linked Otto Ambros and other IG Farben chemists to the pharmaceutical tragedy that left thousands of children with malformations in the 1950s and 1960s. Documents located by investigators suggested that the molecule might have roots in experiments conducted at facilities like Auschwitz-Monowitz, where Ambros had overseen research related to nerve gases. The finding raised a disturbing continuity, from the exploitation of prisoners during the war to the most severe public health catastrophe of the 20th century in peacetime. The shadow of this legacy also reached other names. Richard Kuhn, awarded for his work in chemistry, was discredited when it was revealed that he had requested the brains of executed prisoners for his studies on toxic agents. The German Chemical Society itself decided in 2005 to withdraw its medal bearing his name, acknowledging that someone involved in such practices could not serve as a role model. Despite the progress, access to the truth remained partial. Many information requests continued to meet with denials or the excuse of lost files. The paradox was evident. Transparency was discussed, but key documentation remained missing. Even well-known cases, such as Ambros's authorized trips to the United States in the 1960s, barely appeared in the declassified official archives. The story remained incomplete, as if it still resisted being fully told. The debate surrounding recognitions, still bearing the names of former Operation Paperclip members, reflects the extent to which tensions between memory and pragmatism persist. While some, like Dr. Mark Campbell, publicly defended the validity of the Strughold Award, arguing that the accusations stemmed from distortions spread online, other colleagues within the same association questioned why someone linked to medical crimes of the Third Reich should remain in the pantheon of heroes. The discussion was no small matter. It was about deciding whether science could be separated from the biographies of those who practiced it. The case of Kurt Debus illustrates how these contradictions endured. A former enthusiastic member of the SS and an informant to the Gestapo against a colleague, his name was given to a prestigious award in Florida decades after his record had been declassified. For some executives, his role as the first director of the Kennedy Space Center was sufficient to justify the honor, regardless of what his uniform represented during the war. Thus, the selection of symbols and figures continued to reflect more of a political decision than an ethical analysis. Research in military archives added new layers of unease. Documents found in the Harvard Medical Library revealed a list of doctors involved in so-called mercy killings, extermination practices disguised as medical experimentation. What was surprising was that several of them had been openly recruited under Paperclip, despite US intelligence being aware of their involvement in these crimes. The discovery confirmed that the omissions were not accidental, but part of a deliberate strategy of concealment.